Hello. You might have noticed I haven't posted in a while. Oops. I'll elaborate a bit on why that is later, but suffice it to say I became kind of discouraged with this channel for no real reason. The good news is, recently I've seen a few movies that have kind of reinvigorated my love for the medium. I went to see 2001 in 70mm, and then the following week I saw Anyhoo at the same theater. I also had the chance to rewatch another film that I hadn't seen in several years, and that one's going to be the main subject of this video. But I'll get to that movie soon. For now, I want to talk about an episode of an old TV show that you might be familiar with. The 1961 episode of The Twilight Zone entitled The Shelter is probably my favorite in the series. The Shelter centers around a group of people who've congregated at Dr. Bill Stockton's house to celebrate his birthday. In the first few minutes, we see a couple neighbors heap praise on Bill for his general goodness as a doctor and as a friend. During this conversation, it's also established that Bill is something of a doomsday prepper. He's building a bomb shelter in his basement, a fact which his neighbors lightly mock him for. Suddenly, and conveniently in light of the conversation, Bill's son, Paul, interrupts them to bring their attention to an emergency radio broadcast in the other room. And wouldn't you know it, there's some nuclear bombs on the way. So Bill's neighbors flee the home, while Bill and his family make their final preparations to move into the bomb shelter. Grace, Bill's wife, expresses her nihilism at the situation, saying she doesn't know what survival is worth if it means crawling out of a bunker over rubble and the bodies of their friends. Bill reassures her that they're doing this for the sake of their young son, and the family continue to fill water and gather supplies for the shelter. Before they can make it down to the basement, though, one distraught neighbor reappears and begins to beg to be let into the shelter. Bill declines. He's apologetic, but explains that even one more person being added to the shelter would spell death for them all, as the air filtration system in the shelter is only designed to accommodate 3 people. Before long, the family shut themselves away in their bunker while a mob forms outside, made up of the same neighbors that just attended Bill's birthday party only moments before. They attempt to bargain with Bill, but ultimately decide to break down the door to the shelter instead. The group's desperation and rapid devolution are really front and center here. They become abusive to one another. One neighbor, Frank, begins to attack another man, Marty, with racist remarks and derisions, which ultimately escalate to violence. Throughout these events, the group engages in a flawed kind of logic born out of desperation. After all, what good will a bunker be to any of them if they break down the door with a battering ram? But that's exactly what they do. They use a large metal pole to break down the oddly flimsy nuclear bomb shelter door. Just as they do, another radio broadcast interrupts the chaos. It was all a false alarm. Here is, I think, where the episode really shines. The group all look at one another in stunned disbelief, then relief, and then discomfort. They feebly try to brush off the whole situation. Frank apologizes to Marty for saying racist stuff at him, and then racistly punching him. And then the group tries to apologize collectively to Bill, assuring him that they'll pay for the damages. In response, Bill has this honestly really good thesis statement moment.
I wonder if any one of us has any idea what those damages really are. Maybe one of them is finding out what we're really like when we're normal.
I really like the whole "what we are when we're normal" line there. Sometimes I think it can be easy for us to forget that societies and the relative peace that they afford is kind of an unnatural thing that we humans do. When people are faced with desperate situations and suddenly find themselves cast outside the bounds of that societal protection, they can become quite brutal. Bill's implication that that desperate animalistic state is what we are when we're normal is actually a fairly deep philosophical one. Is animalism really us at our most normal? Is society truly just a thick veil that has been cast over our true brutality? I also love the way this ending implies a future which, although free of nuclear blasts, features its own kind of irreversible destruction. For this group, the veil really has been lifted. Is it even possible to repair the social trust between these people after that? I love this episode so much. There are some absolutely inspired lines of dialogue in this thing. I especially love one moment in which Marty from outside the bunker yells at Bill, telling him that he's a doctor and therefore obliged to help them. In response, Bill has this haunting moment where he does this 1,000-yard stare and says,
"That was 1,000,000 years ago. 1,000,000 years."
Just absolutely spooky, and really hammers home the immediacy with which life as we know it has changed in this story. It's just such a unique and powerful use of the apocalypse event in a piece of art. Many fictional apocalypses ask us to imagine the ways in which people might change when the shit hits the fan. But not many ask us how we'd face one another when the crisis is over, and we have to return to the bounds of civilization. In The Shelter, we see that the mere suggestion of an impending doomsday event can spur an instant change in humanity, an almost immediate return to the state of nature, and suggests that even if that doomsday event never comes, once that Pandora's box has been opened, it may not be possible to put the lid back on. Okay, now for the main event. For the remainder of this video, I want to focus on a film that I believe explores similar questions to the ones posed by The Shelter. It is Danny Boyle's 2002 zombie film, 28 Days Later. And if The Shelter is asking its audience how the social fabric might be affected by the mere suggestion of doomsday, 28 Days Later asks us, what if that doomsday event does come, but only for a time? What happens when doomsday blows over? Now, the way 28 Days Later poses these questions to its audience is quite a bit different than The Shelter. I find that its most powerful takeaways must be inferred, as opposed to The Shelter, which, in line with most Twilight Zone episodes, pretty explicitly spells out its message. In fact, on my first several viewings of 28 Days Later, I just chalked it up as a really good zombie movie. But I didn't really perceive it as a film with great amounts of thematic depth. That all said, I was kind of floored on my most recent watch. What I found was that 28 Days Later was quite a bit more than just a really solid genre film. Indeed, the grimy, body-filled churches and desolate London streets of 28 Days Later harbor some deep and disturbing insights into human nature, and, in the words of Bill Stockton, into what we are when we're normal. So let's explore that now. First, it'd probably be useful to give you a cursory overview of the events of the film, in case you haven't already seen it. The movie opens at the ground zero of its zombie plague. A group of environmental activists break into an animal testing facility and release a caged chimp, who, unbeknownst to them, is infected with an extremely contagious, rabies-like disease known as rage. Then a title card appears. 28 Days Later. Cut to our protagonist, Jim, played by Cillian Murphy, laying in a hospital bed. Jim was a bicycle courier who was hit by a car and fell into a coma sometime, presumably in the last 28 days. It had to be some time before the shit really hit the fan, because Jim has absolutely no idea what's going on. He wanders out into the streets of London, which, like the hospital he came from, are completely devoid of people. He almost gets himself killed by some infected in a church, but is ultimately saved by Selina, a cutthroat survivor of the apocalypse, and Mark, a mostly nondescript character who dies pretty quickly. Mark gets infected and Selina mercilessly slaughters him. Then the two find a father and daughter, Frank and Hannah, holed up in an apartment building. Frank and Hannah are running out of supplies, so they enlist Jim and Selina in investigating a military broadcast advertising safety at a blockade just outside of Manchester. The four pile into Frank's cab and hit the road. To their dismay, the group finds the blockade abandoned. While there, Frank gets infected, and then some soldiers show up and put him down. They take the group back to a nearby mansion, which they have heavily fortified against the infected. The soldiers are living pretty well, all things considered, although they are noticeably restless. Soon, it is revealed that the soldiers intend to sexually assault both Selina and Hannah, an act which is both condoned and was planned by their leader, West, played by Chris Eccleston. He justifies the decision to Jim, saying that women and the prospect of procreation represent a future to these men. Jim tries to take off with Selina and Hannah, but is subdued, and subsequently cast out of the compound. So Jim goes crazy, breaks back into the mansion, and through strategic use of the infection itself, slaughters the soldiers and saves the day, but not before being shot by West and passing out. Alright, so a major focal point of my analysis of 28 Days Later has to do with the way in which the apocalypse changes these characters, and then ultimately asks them to unchange. The most straightforward of these character arcs, I think, is the change that we see in Selina. She is, in some ways, your standard grizzled survivor of the apocalypse. She is altered largely in the way you'd expect a character to be altered by an apocalypse. She has, or at least outwardly portrays herself to have, abandoned any semblance of sentimentality or higher-order desire in favor of a purely survival-based mindset. She expresses this attitude explicitly to Jim when she tells him that staying alive is as good as it gets. The first time she says this is shortly after killing Mark. She then promises to do the same to Jim should he become infected. Real quick, I want to zero in on Mark's death. During an attack by a group of zombies, Mark is bitten. Selina, upon realizing what's happened, and without a moment's hesitation, butchers the man to death, paying no mind to his repeated pleas for mercy. At first, this seems harsh, especially in light of the information the film has given us so far. This crisis began less than a month ago, and this person, who we can assume led a relatively normal life before, has already become able to slaughter someone without any apparent apprehension. But this act certainly seems a bit more justified when other attributes of 28 Days Later's particular version of the apocalypse are taken into account. You see, the rage virus is characterized first and foremost by its sheer unmitigated speed. More abstractly, speed acts as an overarching theme in the film, and can be seen in the literal characteristics of the virus, as well as in the time frame of the crisis and in the general pacing of the film itself. 28 Days seems, at first, like a short period of time for the entirety of Britain to fall into such a complete state of disarray. Similarly, it seems a short period of time for a person like Selina to so fully abandon the moral conventions of normal, civilized life. At first glance, you might be tempted to see this as shoddy or unrealistic writing. And indeed, in similar stories, it can be. For instance, I always had trouble buying the initial events of The Walking Dead, which essentially replicates one-to-one the whole coma plot device of 28 Days Later. I mean, how does society crumble to the level it does in the brief period of time in which Rick is in a coma in The Walking Dead? The difference between the two is that in The Walking Dead, the disease takes up to several days to actually take hold of and transform its victims. An incubation period which you would think would provide enough time for at least some initial attempts by world governments at mitigating the crisis. By contrast, in 28 Days Later, the disease causes transformation in a matter of seconds, and can be transmitted through mere contact with the blood or saliva of the infected. This last detail becomes even more of a horrifying boon to the disease's contagiousness when taking into account the infected's penchant for projectile vomiting onto their prey. In addition to this, the infected of 28 Days Later are not the grumbling, rotting shamblers you might see in other works in the genre. They are, again, more comparable to rabid animals. They sprint and jump and flail about. Average movie zombies typically present danger through their sheer numbers, bearing down slowly but surely on their victims, whereas small numbers of the infected in this film hurl themselves through windows and rush around corners, ripping into their prey so quickly and so violently that they hardly have a chance to react at all. All of this considered, it becomes quite clear how an entire country has fallen to this disease so quickly. It also becomes clear why, to survive this state of affairs, someone must adapt quickly and immediately leave the moral considerations and hang-ups of modern life at the door, as Selena has. But this attitude in Selena is not allowed to go unchallenged in the film. She grapples throughout with the way in which Frank and Hannah are seemingly less affected by the crisis. The two have one another, still share in a familial love, which seems to shield them, at least partially, against the more emotionally and spiritually corrosive realities of the apocalypse. Seeing this healthy, happy dynamic play out acts as a source of hope for Selena and Jim. But this hope is bittersweet, especially, it would seem, for Selena. Throughout the film, we're shown that it's hard for her to cope with seeing this bright light set against such an otherwise dismal situation. Here, I'm gonna focus for a moment on Frank and Hannah and this sort of emotional force field effect they have during their time on the screen. I find it interesting primarily because it's felt in the formalist elements of the film itself. You see, Frank and Hannah's relationship kind of bookends the second act of the film, beginning when Selena and Jim find them in the apartment building and ending at Frank's tragic death at the military blockade. This second act is, simply put, idyllic. From the moment the group departs from London, the film takes on an entirely new tone. Their trip through the British countryside looks straight out of a Windows XP wallpaper. It's vivid, colorful, almost dreamy. Bright, hazy indie pop sets the vibe as the group runs through a seemingly untouched grocery store. They load up on junk food, candy, and high-shelf scotch. It's really not the kind of vibe you'd expect to find right in the dead middle of such an otherwise grim piece of apocalyptic art. Not to lean on an overused bit of imagery, but Frank and Hannah's presence in 28 Days Later really is like a flower growing out of a crack in concrete. The effect of Frank and Hannah's presence, as well as the presence of the second act of the film generally, is multifaceted. It shows the viewer that hope, love, and goodness can still exist even in the most destitute of circumstances. But because of this fact, it also doesn't allow the characters, primarily Selena, to sink entirely into cynicism. The misery of the world and the brutality of people's actions are harder to dismiss, harder to live with when faced with the sheer beauty of this section of the film. It elicits a sort of vulnerability, particularly in Selena, which, wouldn't be necessary if survival really was all that was left to hope for. If, in Selena's words, staying alive really was as good as it gets. But unfortunately, the hope of the second act is crushed by the death of Frank. When the group arrives at the blockade, it is empty. Frank sees a crow picking at the remains of a corpse on a catwalk overhead, and in his frustration at the situation, kicks the building in an attempt to get it to leave. This causes a single drop of infected blood to fall from the corpse directly into his eye. In a panic, he tells Hannah he loves her, and then before he can transform, a group of until now unseen soldiers shoot him. A lot. And now we come to the third act, which descends into a bleakness even more pronounced than we saw in the first. Until this point, we have mainly seen the horrors of the infected. The brutality perpetrated by humans up until this point, although extreme, has been justified. The third act, by contrast, is concerned primarily with the depravity humans are capable of subjecting one another to. And ultimately, it seems to wonder whether these kinds of acts are so different from the behavior of the infected. So, the group arrives at the fortified mansion, which is under the control of Major Henry West, played by Chris Eccleston, and manned by a group of young, restless male soldiers. There's a jocular, locker room air to the whole affair, but at first glance, it appears to be the safest place the group has come across so far. It's made clear fairly quickly that these men fancy themselves to be the future rebuilders of society. This is evidenced first by the way West introduces the facilities, stating that they possess a boiler, and explaining that hot water is the first step toward civilization. West also, at one point, takes Jim out to meet Private Mailer, an infected soldier who's been chained up in the mansion's courtyard. West explains that they're keeping Mailer as an experiment, which will show them how long it takes for an infected to die of starvation. This moment impacts the story in a couple ways. Firstly, it again shows the men looking forward to a time in which this will be over, and they will be the ones to rebuild society. But it also, weirdly, humanizes the infected. Seeing Private Mailer up close, it makes you empathize with the infected. There's this desperation in his eyes. Clearly he isn't fully human anymore, but this moment, the sheer misery of this zombie's existence, it makes you second guess the assumption that there's no personhood left in these creatures. This, I think, acts in tandem with an earlier moment in the film in which Jim kills a child infected. I won't go too deep into that scene, but the important thing to me is that the child speaks. While flailing wildly and attempting to kill Jim, the infected boy screams, "I hate you." The moment really subverts the average zombie film zombie, which is made out to be nothing more than an animated, lifeless husk. Suddenly, the act of keeping this infected man alive and in chains seems an act of cruelty. But here again, we see the future-facing mindset. He is a science experiment of sorts for West, to test the limits of the infected. Whatever cruelty exists in this act pales in comparison to the greater good that it serves. Keep this theme of justifying cruelty in service of the greater good in mind, as it really characterizes the soldiers as a whole, and is deeply relevant to my next point. You see, as soon as the group arrives, an ominous tone creeps into their apparent salvation. Soldiers stare a little too long at Hannah and Selena. This uncomfortable atmosphere culminates when West reveals to Jim that he's promised to provide the soldiers with women. He explains that he found one of the men on the verge of suicide, and to give them hope, promised them women. He tells Jim that, to the men, women and the prospect of repopulation provides hope for a future. In a bid to justify this, he asks Jim about who he's killed since this all began. Jim tells him about the child in the gas station, and in response, West consoles him, assuring him that he only did it because he had to. He's clearly suggesting in this moment that his condoning of the soldiers assaulting the women is just one more ugly but justifiable choice made in desperate times. But this is clearly bullshit. And what I find interesting is the specific way in which it is bullshit. Throughout the film, we've seen ends justifying means. And in those situations, that logic has been pretty reasonable. The killing of Mark, as well as the killing of the boy in the gas station, truly were necessary for survival. The soldiers, by contrast, rather than adopting a survival mindset similar to Selina's, have instead adopted this reconstruction fantasy. Conveniently, this narrative places them in the role of the brave rebuilders of society, the future shepherds of men in the months and years to come, and everyone else in the role of the sheep, which may be herded and used as they see fit. But that is permissible, West argues, because it serves the greater good. The consent, or lack thereof, of these women is rendered meaningless against the greater good of satiating the desires of these men. It's a sort of hypermasculine perversion of the survival mindset, which not only dismisses the killing of infected, which we can all agree is probably permissible given the circumstances, but also permits an almost total abandonment of empathy. I find it a really nice touch in this scene that West is drinking the scotch that Frank took from the grocery store earlier in the film. It really succinctly symbolizes the willingness these men have to trample over those in their way on the road to this future which they mean to shape according to their wills. So Jim, unsurprisingly, isn't cool with all this. But before he can escape with Selina and Hannah, he's subdued and tossed out of the compound. Luckily, though, before he can be executed, he escapes. He makes his way back to the compound, imbued with a new bloodthirstiness. Jim, who until now resisted Selina's brutal anything-to-survive mindset, goes crazy in these last 20 minutes or so of the film. He kills several soldiers in cold blood, one of them unarmed and running away. He shoots the chain restraining the infected mailer, thus releasing him into the mansion to slaughter more of the men. Importantly, through this carnage, Jim is being shot in the same snappy, visceral way that the film has, until now, reserved only for the infected. As a wave of chaos sweeps through the mansion, Jim glides wraith-like above it. Toward the end of this section of the film, one particularly brutish soldier, Corporal Mitchell, holds Selina at gunpoint, still determined to escape with her. Before he can react, Jim swoops down on him from somewhere in the rafters above. He mercilessly beats the man, slamming his head repeatedly into a wall before ultimately gouging his eyes out. He is so ravenous and brutal in this moment that Selina takes him for an infected and almost kills him. Thankfully, she hesitates just before. This moment cements two things. Changes that have occurred in both characters. Selina is softened by her love for Jim, but still deeply damaged by the brutality she's witnessed over the course of the film. Jim, conversely, has been hardened by the things he's seen in the past several days. He is altered, and at the peak of this change, becomes indistinguishable in his brutality from the infected. So, what does this all amount to? I've laid out the various ways in which the apocalypse has spurred change in the film's characters, but that's sort of to be expected in a film of this genre. Earlier, I hinted at the idea that the film shows its characters changing and then ultimately asks them to unchange. So, I want to get into that now. And to do that, I need to explain the film's ending to you. So, after the battle with the soldiers concludes, we're shown another title card, again reading 28 days later. We find our three survivors living in a cottage in the rolling hills and valleys of the British countryside. They're attempting to, and ultimately successfully do, get the attention of a passing rescue plane. A quick insert shot shows us a couple of infected withering away from apparent starvation. And then the film ends. On my first few viewings of the film, I chalked this up to a pretty serviceable, if a little out of place, happy ending. But after my most recent viewing, I actually think this conclusion fundamentally changes the film. This epilogue scene provides us with another dose of tonal whiplash, similar to that of the second act. We find Jim, Selena, and Hannah living a surprisingly normal, even idyllic lifestyle. We also find that West's intuition was correct. This disease, as quickly as it took hold of Britain, has burned itself out. Regular life in a society will presumably resume soon, if it hasn't already. The attitude shared by nearly every character in the film that this crisis would be, at the very least, a long-term affair was wrong. The apocalypse was merely a temporary, albeit extreme, aberration in the ongoing history of civilization, rather than an end to it. To begin tying this all up, I'd like to invoke a concept that I found myself unexpectedly drawn to throughout the course of this film, and that is the concept of the carnivalesque. For those of you that might not be super familiar with art theory, the carnivalesque refers to portrayals of the temporary upheaval of societal norms and hierarchies. This manifests in a myriad of ways, encompassing portrayals of liberation from societal norms, general outlandishness, and open profanity. Really, to my mind, the best way to understand the concept is literally. Think of the environment of a festival. Think of the things that might be acceptable in that environment and only in that environment. We have a yearly arts festival where I live, which I always subconsciously refer to when considering the carnivalesque. There's this sense of a complete and yet temporary undoing of all forms of societal repression. People smoke and drink to excess in this public venue. They walk around semi or completely nude, and it's sounding really debaucherous. And it is, and I'm always surprised that it exists. But I digress. I think, in a way, 28 Days Later is a kind of twisted expression of the carnivalesque. The societal norms, hierarchies, and structures which keep us in line are temporarily but cataclysmically destroyed. I think what's so interesting to me about 28 Days Later is the emphasis it puts on the temporary nature of the carnival. It's fascinating to see humans unshackled from societal norms, but what most works deemed carnivalesque don't show is what it's like for those people to be reshackled when the carnival ends. To draw a bit more on my festival comparison, we see people getting drunk and walking around naked, but what does it look like when they have to sober up, put their clothes on, and go to work on Monday? These are the kind of questions that the end of 28 Days Later makes us ask, except with a darker twist. The carnival of 28 Days Later is not simply a liberating vacation from societal repression, but rather a temporary departure from the kind of moral norms that comprise the very fabric of civilization. Norms like not murdering one another, not otherwise violating or subjugating one another. And I think that really is what I find so haunting about the film's outwardly happy ending. As I've established, these characters have been rapidly and meaningfully changed by the events of the film, and now they must presumably unchange, must attempt to go back to who and what they were before this crisis, back to the norms and boundaries of society. And that is undoubtedly a much more difficult prospect than sobering up and putting your clothes back on after a wild festival. Rather than being faced with the kind of terminal apocalypses portrayed in media like The Road or The Walking Dead, in which memories of society, of civilized life, progressively eke out into the ether of the past, in 28 Days Later, this apocalyptic new normal ends as fast as it began. The acts we've seen these characters commit, even the sympathetic ones, have crossed boundaries that seem irrevocable, have themselves changed in ways that seem irreversible. The prospect of a society descending into chaos, quite literally cannibalizing one another, and then ultimately having to return to those societal bounds sounds nearly impossible. Jim and Selena have come out the other end of this apocalypse relatively unscathed, but in order to survive the zombies, they had to become monstrous themselves. Monstrous in such a way that would seem to permanently disfigure one's moral spirit. 28 Days Later is an examination of the veil that separates humans in a society from the brutality of the state of nature, as well as the potential for brutality that may lie dormant within themselves. It examines the societal norms, rules, and protections which comprise that veil, and which ultimately obfuscate the human capacity for evil. In your average piece of apocalyptic art, that veil is not just parted, but burnt down. Depravity and desperation are the new normal, and no one meaningfully has to answer for this because the desperation of the apocalypse is just how it is now. 28 Days Later, however, offers a 2-month-long peek behind the veil, before ultimately lowering it back down. So, in summation, 28 Days Later, and its happy ending in particular, ultimately leave me feeling more uneasy than the average permanent apocalypse film does. As the film concludes, I find myself thinking again about the conclusion of The Shelter. I think about the way the neighbors look at one another after finding out the government broadcast was a false alarm. There's relief there, sure, to know that the world is not about to end. But then there is obvious discomfort amongst these neighbors as they realize they'll have to go back to living amongst one another after seeing each other at their lowest and most depraved, after themselves being seen at their lowest and most depraved. I also think about Bill's speech. As I see the protagonists of 28 Days Later find their apparent salvation, I can't help but also wonder what the damages really are, and that maybe one of them is finding out what we're like when we're normal. And that's the video. I hope you liked it. I fear it might be a tad disjointed, a bit all over the place. As I touched on earlier, I really fell out of posting on this channel. And I think a big part of that was just this insurmountable feeling that the essays I was writing were just not up to snuff. I had this need to really just argue one specific thesis and to structure that argument as perfectly and tightly as possible. And don't get me wrong, that's a good way to write, and I'm still doing that. This video is still in that vein of, like, you know, quasi-academically written, like, film analysis. But at the same time, you know,